So I'm going to talk today about the two, I have the good fortune today to talk about two different topics. And sorry, I just had to answer something. And the first one is talking about what we've learned from social science about sort of what is the public perception about fire and fire management. Built into that is a little bit of what I will be talking about in my second presentation about what specific views they have in relation to prescribed fire, or what are the barriers kind of to prescribed fire and wildland fire use, or whatever term you prefer to use for that, for managing a naturally ignited fire. So there's a bit of overlap, and I'm going to just skim over the more prescribed fire portions of this first presentations to cover them in the second. So I think the first takeaway I have, and this always takes a minute, there we go, is when we talk about fire, a lot of times when we put our energy and our presentations and our work into fire, we're really looking at the biophysical parts of fire. It's the ecology, it's the fire behavior. And that, if we're just talking about fire, that makes complete sense. But the moment we put that word management in there, we are then fundamentally talking about a social process, because that's what management is. It's a social process. So I think it's really important to remember whenever we talk about fire management, it's often very easy to sort of default to talking about fire ecology and fire behavior and fire modeling, but really we're talking about a social process. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And I think the presentations we heard yesterday all really highlighted that fact beautifully. If I have one takeaway, this is my takeaway: beware of the imagined public. We have a lot of narratives in fire about the public and what they think and how they react to fire and what they prefer and what they don't prefer. And when you actually get empirical data for that, it doesn't support any of these narratives. There's only one that's somewhat supported, and I'll talk about that later. And so, you know, some of these narratives, and I'm going to go over those narratives and what we actually know about them. And one of them, you know, all of them I've been hearing for 20 years now. And one of them I heard was the first one I ran into. I'm still hearing them. And so then the interesting question is, why are we still hearing these narratives if they're not backed up by data? And I think there's two things to keep in mind that help explain that, not entirely, but part of it. And one is sampling bias. So those narratives are sort of often based on our own experiences. And what tends to happen in fire and management is that we hear from the people who are upset with what we're doing. So if people like what we're doing, for better or worse, they probably are not going to make a lot of extra effort to come and tell us that, yay, 3 cheers, I love this. What we hear is the negatives. We hear the people who don't like it. And but what people often do is they take that as a representative sample, when it's not, it's just a bias sample. So we're taking this very biased, non-representative sample and extrapolating it to be everybody. So I think that's part of it. And the other part is confirmation bias. And this is something all humans do. It's a way that we manage all the complexity and the information that we're constantly getting. I think confirmation bias is probably becoming even more prevalent and important as we are sort of slewed with information from every direction nowadays. And what it is basically when we are new to a topic, we seek out information on it. Once we get enough information to sort of form an opinion, we form the opinion, and then new information we get, we tend to give more credence to information that supports that opinion, or we discount information that doesn't support it. So we sort of just, nope, that's not right. And I think you just think of the current narratives in a lot of the media these days, and you'll see good examples of that going on. And so with fire, if you've decided, you know, oh, no homeowners are doing defensible space, you drive through the community and you notice every house that does not have defensible space. But if you're on the opposite tack and you're like, yeah, no, actually this community is pretty good, you'll drive through the community, you'll point out all the ones that do have defensible space, and you'll sort of discount the ones that don't as, oh, they're an outlier, or, you know, oh, you know, you'll come up with a reason why they're not the norm. So some of it is also that we're supporting the narratives by what we pay attention to. So one of the things to sort of start with in talking about the public and why it's important to really understand what the public thinks and everything, a basic premise of good communication, good outreach is you need to know your audience. And another basic premise is you need to understand what good communication is. And too often when we talk about the public, we talk about, oh, we need to educate the public, or we need to get them better information. But the presumption underlying those statements is the problem is they don't have enough information. And if they just have good information, that's going to lead to the behavior change. That has been discounted since the 1960s. Behavior change is much more complicated than that. Providing information will increase awareness, but even increased awareness does not lead to behavior change. And I'll get to some of the things that do lead to behavior change. But it's just really important to remember when we talk about, how do we work with the public? It's not about providing information. That's part of it, absolutely. But it's really about that engagement. It's about some of the examples you heard yesterday. So what I'm summarizing here comes out of a bunch of different studies, not just one, not just two, and most of these are across the United States. This is from a synthesis 2000-2010, follow-up syntheses since then. Broadened it to a lot more research has come out of other countries, and they're all supported by this research. So when I'm talking about these patterns, I'm talking about continue to be seen in the research that's more recent, and it holds up quite well. So the syntheses that we have from that first period, most are done in the US, most do focus on pre-fire dynamics. Since 2010, we started getting a lot more research outside the US, particularly Australia, and a lot of that work has looked at during fire considerations and after fire considerations. And that work, okay, screen, don't freeze. There we go. And that work basically reinforces all the findings. And it sort of also shows that the findings I'm talking about are very similar across all these countries where most of that research has come. Europe started getting more research too, which is also similar. And when we do see difference in the dynamics that I'm talking about, it's more about different institutional structures and policies than it is about sort of how people respond to fire. So Canada and Australia do not have a federal firefighting organization. They're state-based. US is federal. That sort of does shape some of the narrative and some of the policies. And then the other point that comes out is that the key dynamics are also relevant across the temporal gradient. So the dynamics that we found looking mostly at pre-fire, we also find the same key dynamics during and after a fire. So false narrative number one. They just don't understand the fire risk. If we just try to get them to see the risk, then they'll understand something has to be done and they'll support everything. And I was really disappointed the other day to see yet again another fairly well-known organization that has done fire work suddenly say their predominant need for social science was to how do we get people to see the fire risk? And it's kind of, that would be not a good use of resources because there's plenty of research that shows people know they live in high fire risk areas. More often than not, if you're doing an interview and you say, how high is the risk? And they'll say, oh, it's really high. Well, how do you know that? And they'll just look at you like you're crazy and say, well, look around. The problem with a sort of narrative about they don't understand the risk is it seems to be that the assumption is because people aren't doing anything or behaving the way we think they should, it must simply be that they don't see the risk the same way I do. And the problem with focusing on risk is it's actually a really complex and subjective concept. So the basic definition is probability times consequences. So with probability alone, you're beginning to open the door for a wide range of definitions of risk. What's the time frame? Is it the next month? Is it the next year? Is it the next 10 years? What's the spatial extent? Is it my house? Is it the local area? Is it the entire nation? Those will all give different probabilities. And then the type of consequence you're considering also is going to affect the risk you're looking at. So is it my house being lost? Is it a habitat being damaged? And each of those is going to lead to a different risk. So part of the problem with risk is we seem to tend to talk about it as if we're all talking about the same risk. And we tend to have this obsession with risk maps. with the assumption being that everybody's going to like have the same interpretation of risk as was used for how that risk was mapped. And the reality is that's probably not the case. Now, it's even further complicated by the fact that even if everybody does agree on what the risk is, people can respond to the very same risk differently. And there's a couple different factors that come into play with that. So if it's about ability to mitigate, that can be affected by their ability to undertake that action. We call that self-efficacy. And do I have the time, money, physical ability? Do they have the effectiveness? How effective is the action? And that's what we call as response efficacy. So the more effective the action is seen as protecting what you care about, the more likely you are to do it. Trade-offs with the benefits. This is something always happens with risk. We're always making a risk-benefit trade-off. I think if you just think about the conversations we're hearing lately about various vaccines and whether or not they're worth, they're safe to take, the conversation is all around the risk-benefit trade-off of that particular vaccine. Well, the same thing happens with fire. People choose to live out in the woods for a lot of really good positive benefits. It's nature, it's beautiful, it's private, it's where I can afford to have a home. And so they're making calculated trade-offs about the risk. The benefit of this exposure to the risk of fire is just worth it. And so raising the risk level probably isn't going to change their behavior, particularly given that the other part is we all respond to risk differently based on sort of more personality traits. So risk attitude, some people are really risk tolerant. They think it's fun to jump out of planes or jump off buildings in squirrel suits. Others think they're crazy. And we see evidence that exists in how people respond to fire. So there's evidence that when people choose to live, people who are really risk averse, they're just like, nope, that's why we live in town, because it's just too scary out there. And we see evidence about when they choose to evacuate, that they don't evacuate. People who are really risk tolerant are more likely to stay and defend, and people who are financially risk tolerant are more likely to leave early. So how we respond to risk and what type of risk we're comfortable with also shapes our actions. And so what all this kind of boils down to is that, yeah, you do have to see the risk to say maybe we should do something about it. But it's not enough. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. A bunch of other factors come into play in terms of how people respond and whether they act on risk. This is the first one I ever ran into. Smokey, poor Smokey. He's taught the public to think all fire is bad. And the reality of surveys, and these are mostly surveys in the United States, but it's a little different I've seen in Australia, where the conversation is interestingly different, given that they're even more pyrophytic than we are. But certainly in the US, and my guess is Canada, but we only have a few studies there, although they don't contradict anything that I've seen here, is that people understand and that the public actually has a good, and studies are kind of always say, and it was actually remarkably sophisticated, understanding of fire ecology. And they understand that fire has a beneficial role in the environment. So they understand this much more nuanced view of fire than the simple dichotomy that the fire world likes to create of fire, good fire, bad fire. I've never heard the public talk about fire that way. I only hear about it talked about that way by managers. And sometimes they will say that was a bad fire, and it's a perfectly justified statement. And the other demonstration they have this more nuanced view is, again, very consistent across surveys, that roughly 80% see prescribed fire and thinning as an appropriate management tool. Roughly 30% say, yeah, absolutely, you should totally be using it. And 50% say, well, it kind of depends on who's doing it, how you're doing it, where you're doing it, and those sorts of things. And this is mostly work in the US, but more recently, a study out of Australia looked at their views of prescribed fire and found similar findings. And the other thing that comes out clearly in these studies is that there's just a very clear preference for active management. And I've kind of gotten to this point where, since we still keep on blaming the bear 20 years, after I first learned that this doesn't hold up, I feel the need to kind of support him. His message is very simple. It's don't go start fires in the wood. And when I've asked the members of the public, what's his message? They're like, that I should be responsible when I'm in the woods. And I think that's a good message. I'm not really sure we want to change it, and it really wouldn't work because campaigns like Smokey only work for very simple messages and simple behaviors. And the other thing I like to point out is we've been suppressing fire since the early 1900s, and Smokey only came along in 1944. And relatively speaking, he's fairly benign. These are the messengers we had before Smokey. This is in 1926. This is in 1933. And this is in 1942. And this is when we really got this idea of fire as the enemy. It was really born out of World War II, when actually the Japanese did try to set the West Coast on fire. So that was born out of an actual risk. The third narrative, people don't take responsibility. And this is kind of the one I hear most often. Really, there's a strong sense of shared responsibility. People say, you know, I chose to live here. This is my land. It's my job to manage my land. They are concerned about, you know, but my neighbor's risk affects mine. And that's a very good example of how we don't respond to risk differently. I've talked to homeowners who are like, oh, my neighbor's property is terrible. So I've done even more work sort of to try to compensate. I've run into others who are like, oh, my neighbor's property is terrible, so I haven't bothered because there's no point. And I've run into people who said, oh, my neighbor's property is terrible. So I went over and talked to them and found out what the issue is. And now we're working together to mitigate the risk on both our properties. So same perception, same problem, very different responses. And the further evidence that there's a strong sense of shared responsibility is that those people who say, studies again, lots of surveys, it's very consistent. At least 2/3 have undertaken some type of mitigation. More often, it's like 80 to 90% who indicate that they've taken some type of mitigation. And often this shared responsibility is they expect the government to take care of the problem. So what do they actually expect of the government? Well, you manage your land. And that's often when they talk about adjacent properties, they're talking about adjacent federal properties in the US. And so if you tell me to manage mine, you better manage yours. They would like information, but it's specific. It's not this generic, there's a bad fire risk and generic defensive space. It's for my property, what are the specific factors I need to worry about? Where's the fire likely to come from? Should I like clear a little bit more on that side of my property? I can't take out this tree because my grandmother planted it. So how do I adapt the mitigation on my property to account for that? And maybe help with larger scale obstacles. And that tends to be getting rid of vegetation, particularly important in communities where the vegetation grows back quickly. You have lots of elderly who just physically can't remove it, or you might have really steep terrain where it's just really hard to safely remove the vegetation unless you're trained in how to do it. And then finally, there's all these demographic narratives. New residents, that's the group we like to blame the most. And that's kind of, it's all these new people, they're moving in, they don't get the risk, they don't do anything, and there's no consistent data showing that they're less aware or active in relation to fire mitigation. In fact, there's a little bit of findings that suggest that they're more proactive than long-term residents. And there's two explanations for that. In the United States, at least 60% of moves in the US are within the county. So those new people are new to the neighborhood, they are not new to the fire risk. 20% are within the state and 20% are from out of state. Now, again, that out of state, you might say, oh, well, then they're the ones who really don't understand the fire risk. Well, in the Western US, a lot of those people who have come from out of state in recent years have come from California. And California has had vegetation management ordinances in most parts of the state since the 1990s, early 1990s, and has had a building code for the WUI since 2005. So those people move in and they look around and they go, this is not acceptable. And they're actually the ones who kind of get the community moving forward. And the other dynamic going on is confirmation bias. So when they move in, they're new, they're like, oh, I better find out how things work here. And they're receptive to new information. People who've lived in a place for a long time, they form their story about what the dynamic is and what the fire risk in it is and what appropriate management is. And so they're going to be less responsive to new information. And that's a really good place where that example of sitting down and listening to people and learning about their knowledge is a very good example. They often know more than we do about the fire risk on that landscape. Similarly, part-time, there's no evidence that they're less likely to understand fire risk. Whether or not they're less likely to mitigate is mixed. A lot of studies find no difference between them and part-time. The few that do It's really about time and not knowledge. It's not that we don't understand the fire risk. It's that I'm here on the weekend. I'm not going to spend my weekend mucking around in the vegetation. Experience, there's kind of like this narrative in the fire community, oh, we just haven't had any big fires, so everybody's apathetic and we need another big fire. And decades of research on natural hazards, which is supported by more recent research on fire, shows that experience does not have a consistent effect. Again, it's one of those, some people it will be the aha, oh, this is what they were talking about, we better do something. Some people it will be, that fire jumped an 8-lane freeway. There is no point in doing anything. There's nothing I can do that's going to make any difference. And probably the majority of people will say, well, you know, what we did last time worked, so we're going to keep doing what we did. Australia, 2009, lots of drama, a lot of people evacuated through flames and trees and smoke. And they did interviews afterwards and found that most of them would, you know, had no plans to do anything different because they'd gotten through and it had worked. All that experience does is it creates a consistent, it creates more salient. So it moves fire into something that they're going to pay attention to, something they're going to worry about. But psychologists have this term that humans only can manage a finite pool of worries. We can only worry about so much at one point in time. So we, you know, if it's not right there in front of us, it tends to get slopped out of the pool of worries. And so when people aren't paying attention to fire, it's really not an indication of apathy. Apathy means they don't care. What it means is they have a lot of other things on their plate that they're worrying about, and they just don't have time or the sort of mental capacity to constantly be worried about fire. And I don't think it would be appropriate to expect people to constantly worry about fire. And then finally, basic demographic characteristics. We kind of want to put people into a really big box, that it's this group, education or income or something like that, or regional differences. In the US, we often want to say the Southeast, they get fire. And at the social level, really, there's no indication the dynamics are different. What's really different is their ecosystem, which makes it a lot easier to do prescribed burning. There's a lot more leeway, and they have to do it every 2 to 3 years to keep up with the vegetation growth. So people see it all the time. And that will fit into what I'm going to talk about in a minute. But in the end, we kind of want to put everything in the social into these really big boxes that make it easy to understand, but where you see the variability, because you will find places where new people don't get it. But it's very local. It's that local context. What's the relationship between the agency and the community? What's the fire history here? Michigan has a place where there was a prescribed fire that escaped in the 1981, I believe, and it's still a barrier to trying to get prescribed burning done. So the local context is really the key ingredient that needs to be understood. Okay, so I've talked about all these things that aren't influential that we think are. What is knowledge? The more people understand and practice, the higher you have acceptance levels. The ecological benefits are important, and whether local knowledge and context are taken into account can influence your response. The next one is trust. Trust in the information provider or in the treatment implementer, particularly with prescribed fire. That really does shape acceptance of prescribed fire. And then the next one is interactive communication. So it's not this providing information, it's asking questions, listening, finding out what the dynamic is. And it's particularly important when we're looking at really complex topics like fire and fire mitigation and fire use, which are incredibly complicated, because it allows people to ask questions, they can clarify, you can clarify your misperceptions about what their concerns are or what they don't understand. And so that really allows a dialogue that helps people really truly understand the complexity. And it helps build trust. People find out, oh, you actually really know what you're talking about. You have really good intent. I'm still not really thrilled with prescribed fire, but I trust you, so it's okay. And it builds trust. And the other point with trust is transparency. It's a heuristic for trust. A heuristic is basically a rule of thumb. It's sort of like confirmation bias too. It's a way we simplify the world. And transparency is a really quick way that we judge whether or not we can trust the people who are giving us information, or we can trust the information. Is it really giving us the straight scoop? So part of, you know, the reason why one of the vaccines is people are skeptical is because they keep giving non-transparent information out, and that we sense it. And so that's one reason we're kind of like, I'm not so sure about that one. So transparency is a really critical part of communication. People will know, and you're always better off just giving people the straight scoop than trying to like beat around the bush. Fire studies show that interactive communication is preferred. It's the most consistent characteristic in determining whether information is seen as trustful and useful. And there's a really clear preference for one-on-one consultations and information from local sources. That local source I kind of glossed over, but it's really critical. It's, again, how people can determine if it's trustworthy. It's like, oh yeah, they really understand this area, so I'm going to pay attention to this. No single information source is uniformly best. It can vary by location, it can vary by type of information, it can vary by the person. So the key is use all the possible sources you can. You just need to have a consistent message. And the good part with fire is that government information sources are generally preferred and trusted, and often very highly rated. Not always. There's some states in the US where the Department of Natural Resources does not have a great reputation and is not highly trusted. So it's not always the case, but in general, government sources, particularly the local fire department, that's where people would love to get their information. And then the final comment about communication is this idea of integrative complexity, which comes out of communication theory. And this is work they have done that shows that when people have sort of a really simple understanding of a topic, their views tend to be more extreme. So they're stronger, but they're unstable. So they're more prone to change. So when we get too focused on getting everybody on board with fire, we often simplify our message. And so we might get people who immediately think it's a good idea, but then when something goes wrong, odds are good that it's going to backfire. And what they've shown is that when people have more complex understandings, their views might be more moderate, but they're much more stable. And that I think is actually a really good thing, particularly with something like fire, where it's unfortunately inevitable that something will go wrong no matter how careful we are. And so it's important to remember that people who raise concern about negative outcomes, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't support it. So again, that sampling bias I talked at the beginning, somebody raising questions about smoke and how are you managing it, that doesn't mean that they're inherently saying they don't like smoke. It just means they understand the complexity of the topic. And so that's actually can be a good sign. And that Australian study I talked about found that those who raised concerns about prescribed fire, they still supported its use. So it's not a given if somebody raises a concern that they don't support it. It just may be actually a positive indication that people are developing that really complex understanding that means that they will support fire in the long term. So how does this work as a model? This is kind of the model we have that like, well, that's all that's needed. Nah, that's part of it. They need to understand the benefits and why you're doing it. Concerns can come into play, and with prescribed fire, escape and smoke matter. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And I think you will, in between my talk and the next talk, you will hear a lot about smoke from Pete. Trust, do we trust the people? Are they credible? Are they competent? And then what's the communication process, which shapes trust and shapes understanding. So other themes that came out of that more recent synthesis, place attachment is important. We sort of underestimate that people really care about where they live, and so they want the landscape to be in really good shape. There's reasons why they rebuild, and that needs to be taken into account. Outreach programs, a lot more work has been done on outreach programs, shown that integrating fire agency staff and community members is particularly helpful, programs that help do that. When they take local context into account, they're more successful. They're more likely to foster preparedness, to engage those part-time residents, and to identify and address those specific local barriers that are really inhibiting what's going on. Social interactions and networks, those are also a key part of the process. They can help really build that community capacity, strengthen communication. That's a great way to increase information sharing. I often hear managers sort of say, we only get 10 people at our meeting, and that I'm kind of like, well, of course there's only 10 people at your meeting because people have lives and fire's not their obsession like it is for most of us. And so it makes sense, but you shouldn't assume that those 10 people are not then going back home and talking to 3 people each or 4 people or 5 people. And there's studies that show that a lot of people that get their information from neighbors, and that can be just as influential as information from the fire community. It's also important to remember that these networks can be focused or diffuse. We often tend to focus on about social networks and interactions at the sort of like the really focused neighborhood level of, we're going to have a neighborhood work party and that kind of stuff. And that can be very useful in some neighborhoods. There's a lot of places where people move there because it's a very communal neighborhood. There are a lot of other places people move there expressly not to talk to their neighbors. So having communal programs is probably not going to work very well there. That does not mean that there's not a network and there are not interactions in that community. It's just those networks tend to be focused around sort of emergency response. I'll help you if you're in trouble. You'll help me when I'm in trouble. And so they have a network, and that's actually a great network for fire, right? But it means that your messaging might want to be a little bit different, and the type of approach might be different. And a study out of Australia kind of focuses on, I demonstrate this process really well. They sort of found that this program, which was focused on a neighborhood, a street block, it helped build social networks, and that led to the development of these shared goals and sense of community. And this process in turn then created the sense of shared responsibility. Hey, we're all in this together. We all need to prepare to look after ourselves and our neighbors. And they concluded that rather than sort of focusing on providing information, agencies that work to facilitate social network development, that was the most efficient way to encourage preparedness. And then sort of now at the end, I'd like to kind of highlight that there's some not useful concepts that keep popping up. I have this personal obsession with the term megafire, which I find very problematic. It's like, what's the definition of megafire? If it's 100,000 acres, then that means Europe has no megafires. Is it the number of homes that were burned? So beyond the fact that it has no clear definition, it's also the fact that talking about megafire and the era of megafire, I'm not sure that's a good way to engage people in the notion that we need more fire on the land. Like, you're sort of starting with this dramatic negative term and then saying, and yes, we need more fire. So I don't think when we frame things in these sort of drama, ostensibly, I'm told, to get people's attention, it's the type of attention you want to get. So using these terms, I'm not sure really sets the stage for a productive conversation. And similarly, overly simplistic or binary framing sort of doesn't fit. That sort of feeds into that integrative complexity of too simple. And it doesn't get you where you want to go. So good fire, bad fire, smoke now, smoke later. If I am a mom with a child with asthma and you say, well, how do you want your smoke now? Or you want your smoke later? I'll say, I will take the smoke later, because then my kid might be already grown up and gone to college. So, it's not inherent that these binaries are going to get you the answers that you want. And I don't think they lay the groundwork for the conversation. So to summarize, it's really important to continually assess your notion of the imagined public with empirical reality. If you say, oh, I know what the public thinks, just take a step back and say, well, what is that based on? Communication is key. Constant communication, transparent. Everybody's going to pay attention to fire at different points in time. Risk interdependence. And everybody totally recognizes that fire is a shared risk. And I would love for us to shift how we talk about shared responsibility. Right now, I hear it talked about less as a shared responsibility. It's framed that way, it's said that way, but the tone is really, they need to take responsibility. And that's not shared. That's what I call shifting responsibility. Truly shared responsibility is saying, hey, we are all in this together. We all have a part to play. How do we all help each other play that part? Interactions in social networks matter. Listening is critical. That's, I guess, probably one of the other great takeaways. It's really important to listen. Take local context into account is important. Improved outcomes are more likely when we treat the social with the same level of attention and rigor as biophysical. We do have a really solid base of social science, but if you compare how much money and research goes into understanding the biophysical, it's no small surprise to me that we are still continuing to say the same things that we said 50 years ago, because we're continuing to approach the problem and identify solutions based on the biophysical. And until we sort of treat it with the same social science and the social problem with the same level of detail and complexity. We often have really simplistic social solutions. We're probably not going to change much. And then finally, think outside the fire vacuum. A lot of the community and homeowners and property owners, as I said, finite pool of worries. Fire is one thing in their lives. And oftentimes the solution is recognizing how fire fits into the rest of their lives, finding additional ways to find benefits to fire that match benefits to other aspects of their lives. And if we sort of really think about how fire fits into the bigger picture, then I think we can get to the point where we will be able to live with fire, because then we're really treating it as part of life. And I think I've seen in the chat box that there's been some of these have come up, but if you don't know about Tree Search yet, it's a really great resource. All Forest Service funded research can be downloaded for free, and it's a pretty easily searchable database. And that's it. I'm not sure where I am on time and whether we have time for questions. Probably not.
That's great, Sarah. Thanks so much. Perfectly on time, I'd say. Well, you sort of blew my theory out of the water about public perception of these catastrophic mega fires, but it's, you know, that was a great presentation. Really good information in that. There are some questions. We've got time for at least a couple questions here. There are, just go through the chat box here. There's some good resources which have been posted in the chat, so people can take a look at that and dig into the resources if you're interested. Some words of thanks to you. So here's one, thanks, super presentation. What do you propose should be the dominant messaging or conduit for fire knowledge when there's major distrust with municipal, local, and state provincial governments? It's a great question.
It's a really good question. And it's a really hard question to answer on Zoom.
Yeah.
I think a really good place to start is to have listening sessions. Sometimes where that, I mean, one is to do a little bit of research and history and identify, like, is there a specific source of that lack of trust? Like, are there certain events or activities that have led to the lack of trust? So that's part of it. Part of it then is like sitting down and actually listening to people, and sometimes just letting people vent and feel like they've been, not feel like, know that they have been heard, can go a long way to then letting them actually listen on their end. Sometimes people keep talking and yelling because they feel like they're not being heard. And so starting the conversation, helping people feel like they've been heard, and really sort of trying to get at where that trust is. It takes time to build trust. But I think if you can go, if you actually sit down and listen and you pay attention and you show that you value where people are standing, that doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It doesn't mean you have to say, well, then we're going to do it your way. But people need to know that their points of view are being heard. So I think starting with ways to listen to people. There's also, on one of my slides, I have a picture of a guide about trust that was put together. Actually, and that's one that was put together with Tara McGee in Alberta, and then the US and Australia, which is a guide to managers trying to build trust that could also be useful.
That's great, thanks, Sarah. Here's another one. Are there any key differences between US and the Canadian contexts and or key geographical gaps?
Well, there's always differences in contexts. At the level that I'm talking about, those sort of variables about understanding and knowledge and trust and interactive communication, in the studies that have been done in Canada that I've seen, you know, Bonnie McFarland and Tara's work and Amy Christensen's, I have not seen evidence that the dynamics at that level are different. There are undoubtedly differences at sort of more specific local levels. You do have sort of an interesting dynamic of, you know, most of your populations within 30 miles of the US border, and your big dramatic fires are up north where they're very big landscape boreal fires. And so that's an interesting question to me about like how that shapes how people see fire differently, and whether it does. It may not. In the US, people who live in lodgepole pine, they get it. They know that that's a stand replacement fire kind of ecosystem. So I don't know that I see major differences. Probably one of the other differences might be that you're more state-based in your fire response than we are. And that can also shape interactions. But I have not seen differences that lead me to say, oh yeah, Canada's completely different. Similarly, I don't think Australia is completely different either. Just slightly in the institutional differences is where I've seen differences.
All right. We'll do one more here, then I think we'll cut it off for this presentation at least. The question here is there a specific case example you can point to that successfully managed public perception and reduced fire risk?
Yeah, there actually are tons of them that I'm familiar with, but I will go to my favorite, which is where I did my dissertation, which is Incline Village, Nevada. And so in the second slide, I had the picture of that really dramatic fire on the left-hand side with little lights around it. Those little lights are all home, that's Incline Village. Those little lights are all homes that are worth millions of dollars. The fire itself, you probably figured out, was prescribed burn because it was square. But, you know, very dramatic. No one in that town complained because they've been working with them since 1988. The town's basically in a forest. If you fly over it, you wouldn't know there's a town there. And so they really do have to manage their forest. And they've really worked with the community to sort of say, hey, we have a lot of public land in the forest in our town. We need to be burning that. And you need to do your mitigation. And so they really have done it. And so you can do those prescribed burns that nobody complains about. And my favorite story from that one that gives a good example of how you can work with a homeowner over time is it is mountainous. So they have valleys, and there's one place where they needed to burn up on the hill. The smoke was all going to come down the valley and gather at this one person's house, who, needless to say, was not really thrilled when they said that we're going to try to do prescribed burns up there. But they spent, you know, a good year going and talking to him and explaining him what they did. And they did a burn and the smoke came down to his house. And he was like, all right. A couple of years later, when they were going to do another burn, the season was not good, so they didn't burn. And he called the fire department up and said, hey, you guys are not doing your job. I'm not getting enough smoke at my house. So you can actually really shift people's opinion if you engage them and address their concerns.
Communication is key, isn't it?
Yep.
That's a big takeaway from this. Thanks so much, Sarah. There's a last question in the chat about how people can reach you. So if everybody who's looking to reach out to Sarah or the other presenters, go to the Crown Managers Partnership Fire Forum website. You'll find abstracts for all the presenters, and in there you'll find Sarah's email, or you can probably reach out to her, send a private chat within the chat there directly to Sarah if you're looking for different contact information.
And I very much welcome emails and questions and even phone calls. It helps me understand where the science is helpful, where it's not, and where we might need more work done. So I really do welcome those discussions.